My name is Sharon K. Gillenwater, and I've been an entrepreneur for 25 years. But I'm not the kind of entrepreneur that we usually see in the news. I didn't go to Harvard or Stanford. I didn't go to fancy schools. My parents didn't go to college. And I didn't get into business until I was 30 years old. As I was kind of floundering around in my 20s, I worked in a magazine, I did freelance writing, and then I got married and I achieved my dream of moving to San Francisco from Southern California, where I was from. I came to San Francisco the first time when I was 13 years old, and I fell absolutely in love with it. And I said, I'm going to get there someday. And I did, but I was 30 by the time I got there. I ended up getting a job at a startup of around 30 people, couple $1 million in revenue at the time. And I loved it. I felt like I had found my people. The thing I love about startups is if you can get shit done, they don't care where you're from, where you went to school, who you know, how much money you have. And that's not really true with the Silicon Valley startups. I'm talking about the more bootstrap startups that nobody's ever heard of. So I worked in the startup and I did very well there. I did a lot of great work and I was a leader within the company within just a couple of years. And so I developed this love of startups, but also this confidence I had really been lacking in my career. It was late 90s in San Francisco. Everybody was starting something. So I started a company with my husband, my brother-in-law, and sister-in-law. And it was an email newsletter company. And we bootstrapped it for a while, but we were talking to venture capitalists, not because we really needed it, but because in those days, if you didn't raise venture, you were not considered bona fide. You were not considered a real startup if you didn't have VC. This really was not the kind of company that should have been raising venture capital, but we sought it out because everybody was doing it and we wanted to be legit. So just by some stroke of luck, this was a content company, and we found this company in Southern California that was a venture incubator, and it had a lot of ex-Disney people. So they were legitimate content creators. They had built Disney's first online properties. And so we thought this is a great fit. And lo and behold, we were able to raise $3 million from them. And the month we raised the money was the month that the NASDAQ crashed. And there wasn't a lot of alarm at first. People thought, oh, it'll come back. But that crash was more prolonged and worse than any of us thought. In San Francisco, everybody was unemployed, but they had made so much money during the boom that they kind of were ready for a break anyway. But here I was running my startup with my venture capital. And after a few really rough months with the NASDAQ, this firm fired their CEO, brought in a new CEO who wanted to focus only on biotech, and it was pretty clear that they wanted out of the deal. Now, we had a contract, so they had committed to fully funding us. But here's the thing that I learned about venture capitalists. By what the contract says, if they want out and if they want you out, they will get you out and they will get out of that deal. So what they did in our case is they sued us for fraud. We were not committing any kind of fraud. In fact, we had revenue coming in. We weren't profitable, but we had real revenue. But they wanted out, and our lawyer said, you should just settle. So we settled. So then after that, I had a really terrible job. I write about this in my book if you want to learn that story. Like the worst job imaginable. And I came out of that and I said, you know what? I never want to work for anybody ever again. And so I started consulting. I did all kinds of consulting. I put out an email that said, my shingle is out. I will do whatever you want. And my first job was making gallons and gallons of private label pasta sauce that was going to be sent off as samples to Williams Sonoma for a friend of mine who was in the gourmet products business. He paid me $200. Then I did other things, like I did PR and communications for an aircraft carrier museum. I did some work for a super shady golf resort in Florida. They tried not to pay me. I threatened to sue them. In fact, I had such shady little clients in those early days that I had to sue like 3 times, and I won every time. Then one day, a guy who used to be my assistant at that first startup that I landed at in San Francisco, while I was off having babies, he was moving around from company to company and moving up in the ranks. He called me and he said, get down here. He was at an event marketing agency. He said, I've got this big project for Intel. You'd be perfect. And I said, what are you talking about? I know nothing about the tech industry. And he said, you're going to be great. Come on down. And so I went down there and I talked to his boss. I remember talking to his boss. I didn't give a presentation or anything. We were just talking. And later his boss was telling all these people, like, that was the best presentation I've ever seen. And I swear to this day, he was talking about someone else and got me confused with that person because I didn't give a presentation and I was not particularly impressive. I didn't know anything about Intel. But anyway, I got the job and I started working with my former assistant, and we became this dynamic duo, and we did really great work for all these tech companies in the Valley, and he kept moving from agency to agency and moving up and up and up, and he took me with him every time as his right-hand contractor, and I started making great money. And pretty soon he was so senior that I was just doing a lot of the work on my own, and I barely ever talked to anyone at the agency that was farming me out. I was going in directly to Cisco, to Oracle, to Microsoft, doing all of these strategy projects. And I started to notice a problem across all of those clients that kept coming up over and over again. And it's a little in the weeds, but stick with me. Like 2004, 2005, 2006, around there. And what was happening as technology was becoming more and more fundamental for every company, the deals kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, 7 figures, 8 figures. So the leadership of these big companies would say, holy shit, what is this technology we're deploying? Why is it so expensive? What is it going to do from us in terms of moving our business forward or cost savings? And it put the salespeople in big tech in the position of having to go into the C-suite to talk about business challenges with their customers. And these salespeople were just used to talking about their own products and speeds and feeds. They had no idea how to have a real business conversation. And so I started investigating this and researching it and trying to help my customers figure this out. And what I learned is these have to be one-to-one conversations, and you have to go in knowing as much as you can about that C-suite executive, their personal interests, where they went to school, where they worked in the past, who they know, and definitely what their business initiatives are. And I would figure this out by reading through all of their earnings call transcripts, which nobody wants to do. I mean, they're dense, they're pages and pages long, they're full of jargon, and you have to really understand what to look for if you want to be able to have a business conversation in the C-suite. And I figured all that out. So I narrowed the focus of my consulting to just that, engaging the C-suite and C-suite selling. That's what we called it. And I built a name for myself at these big tech companies. I was like the go-to person to help with this. And I developed decks and frameworks and a way of profiling these executives and research tools. But I was delivering all this stuff in slides, and I was exhausted because there was a lot of demand and I was making a lot of money. And so I started training other people I knew to do this kind of consulting, and they would do like all the research and the decks in the background, and I was like the client-facing person, and I would present all the work. So my name and my work became very connected to this field. And I had 2 little kids at the time. I was in my early 40s, and I was exhausted. And I thought, how can I build a business that is separated from my personal hours? Because in order to make more money, I or some of the consultants backing me, we were all going to have to work more hours. And here was a critical thing. I realized that all the tech companies were basically chasing the same 2,000 or so corporate executives in America. So I knew if I could build a database of intelligence about those 2,000 people, I'd be set to go, and I could turn it into like a self-service SaaS product. And so that's what I set out to do, but it sounds a lot easier than it was. It was a lot harder to build technology back in those days. I didn't even know what a database was. I certainly couldn't, you had to hire a developer, and they were very, very busy and very expensive. So I was kind of a little stuck at that point. I was still doing all the consulting and making good money, but I was at a loss for how I could build this product. Because while I was making money, I wasn't making that much. Like I couldn't afford to just put a bunch of my own money into it. So one day I was talking with this friend of mine who had just been like a normal schmo like me since I knew him, but he started a company and he had just sold it. I don't know for how much, but it was for millions. And I was telling him about this idea that I had, and he said, well, you need to put all these executive profiles in a database and maintain it and then sell subscriptions. And I said, I know, but I don't have the money to build a database. And he said, I'll write you a check for $125,000 right now. And he said, and I just want to always have 10% of the company. So if you ever take more investment, let me know and I'll kick in more just to maintain that 10%. I don't know why, but that's what he wanted. It was like a 5-minute conversation. I was so lucky. So I had my angel investor. I took the money and I built my database and I started trying to sell it. And that was the hard part because my customers who were all interested in C-suite engagement and selling, they didn't want a self-service product. They still wanted me. They wanted me to do everything and deliver and spoon feed everything to them. So really in the beginning, I was just using the tool that I had built as a tool for my internal consulting. And as much as I would try to get them to pay me for a subscription, it wasn't working, which is kind of crazy because they were paying me way more as a consultant. And that's when I realized the reason why they wanted me doing it is because they didn't actually know what to do with the information that I was giving them. So I provided all this extra consulting about how they could use the information. I would even write emails that their executive should send to the target executive and base that email on the intelligence that came out of my database. And this went on for a couple of years. And so finally I was getting very frustrated, like how can I turn this into a product? I'm kind of stuck in this consulting thing. And so I decided I needed to start talking to exited entrepreneurs who had done what I was setting out to do. So I tried to find people who had built these data tools and built them up and sold them to bigger companies. And I found a few of those folks and I talked to them and I told them, look, here's what I'm doing, but I feel stuck. What would you do if you were in my shoes? And I committed to having one of those conversations every day for 30 days. I mean, I'm an introvert. I don't like to pick up the phone, but I forced myself to do it because I knew that my success would depend on it. I actually started really enjoying these conversations. I was learning a ton. People were very friendly. They wanted to help. It was in the middle of a big recession, so nobody had anything going on. And so we were just shooting the shit on the phone. Almost every conversation, they'd refer me to 1, 2, 3 other people. So it just snowballed, and then I was having lots of conversations, multiple ones every day. I talked to this one guy, Bobby Martin, who had built a tool and he had sold it to Dun & Bradstreet, and he said, you need to meet my friend Lee Demby. He said, look, Lee is not just a salesperson, he would be a perfect partner for you. So I got to know Lee. We talked for about 9 months. I flew out to Charlotte to meet with him because he's on the other side of the country, and we hit it off. And I was ready to make him an offer after a month, but he is much more cautious than I am. So he stretched out the conversation for about 9 months, and would call me like once every couple of weeks to hear updates. And finally, he decided to sign on as an official partner. And I gave him a chunk of equity. And it wasn't even a couple of months when Lee said, Sharon, I can't sell this database if we can't define what's in it. And I can't believe I had overlooked this, and this is an important lesson if you're building a similar product. I was profiling executives that I knew my consulting customers cared about, but we couldn't draw a box around that data. We couldn't say, oh, we have, the Fortune 500 chief information officers or the Fortune 250 CFOs. There was no definition, and so he said, before I can really take this to market properly, we need to build a box of data. And so he got a couple of his buddies to pitch in about $25K each, and my original angel pitched in a little more to keep him at 10% ownership. And I went crazy with a group of contractors, and we built out about 2,000 profiles in a summer. And then Lee started selling. It was slow going, but he closed deals with big tech companies. And as I look back, our product had so many shortcomings. It was super clunky. The user interface was hideous, but the information was so solid that they were willing to overlook those things. And we started getting subscriptions. And finally, after like almost 2 years, we finally could start paying ourselves. And it started slow, like we can pay ourselves $2,000 a month each. Then after a few months, maybe $3,000 a month each. So the momentum was very slow. And a lot happened over the next 12 years. Can't go into all of it. This video would be way too long. And if you want to learn more, you can read my book or watch some of my TikToks or other videos. It wasn't until about 2016 that we thought, we've really got something. This is a solid business. I think we had crossed over $1 million in revenue, and we were on our way, because that $1 million mark, what they say about it being magical and proving the viability of your business, is really true. We could just feel it. We ended up bringing on a couple of salespeople, and Lee worked very, very closely with them. They were young people with not much sales experience, but he worked super carefully and closely with them, and they took off. And the next thing you know, we've got like 3 to 4 million in ARR. And then COVID hit, and we didn't know what was going to happen. We thought it might tank our business, but we actually doubled in size during COVID, because these executive-to-executive conversations had become more critical than ever. And instead of an executive flying across the country for 1 or 2 meetings, suddenly they were stuck in their homes having like 12 meetings a day, and they needed intel on those people they were meeting with. So that was really good for our business. So we get to like 2021. So that is, 10 years after Lee had joined. And now we have a team of like 25, 28 people in South Carolina. We have a dedicated team of 25 in India. They were through a vendor, but they were a dedicated team that had been working with us for years. So we've got like lots and lots of employees and families depending on our business, which was super exciting, but also very scary. And Lee and I knew that a tech crash was coming. Remember, our customers were highly concentrated in tech, so we were always very worried. Tech flies high, and then inevitably there's a crash, and we didn't want to be on the wrong side of that. We thought, we are too old for this. We are exhausted running the business in good times. We couldn't imagine running it in bad times. Plus, there were murmurings of this Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we had a team in Russia that was our web development team. And at that same time, because you reach a certain amount of revenue, you get on the radar of private equity firms and maybe potential strategic acquirers. And we were getting phone calls. And at one point, a private equity firm called me and they said, we could give you a term sheet today for $48 million. That got my attention. I called my original angel, who by this time has sold a bunch of other companies, and he was planning an IPO for his current company. He said, Sharon, you should never negotiate with just one buyer. He said, if you're serious about selling the company, you need to hire an M&A banker and you need to run a process. And I ran into Lee's office after that phone call and I said, what's an M&A banker and what's a process? He explained it to me. He said, look, it's like hiring a realtor to sell your house. It's the same thing, only the house is your company and the numbers are a lot bigger. And it's a lot more complicated, but it's pretty much the same thing. He said to me, even though he was the one with the finance background, he said, you have the most to win or to lose from this transaction, so you need to run it. And I said, okay. So I interviewed a bunch of bankers. I interviewed a bunch of their references, people whose companies that they had sold. I decided on a banker in September of 2021. We started our process. In November, a couple months later, we got our first and only offer. It came from a public British company called Euromoney, who had bought a bunch of other companies in our space. They made a very weird offer of 17 to 20 million. Even our banker said they'd never heard someone give a range like that. And I called Michael, my original angel, and I'm like, this is just not enough money. And he said, well, what do you want? And I said, I want 30. And because remember that whole private equity offer of 48, Michael had told me that's total bullshit. They're never going to give you 48. They're just throwing out a number to get you interested. So that really wasn't a real benchmark, but 30 was a number that I could get behind, especially if it was in all cash, which their offer was. So I went back and had the nerve to ask for 30 when they had offered 17 to 20, and we ended up getting 25. And Lee and I had discussed it beforehand that 25 was our walk away number. So we got exactly what we wanted. And in hindsight, getting it in all cash is just perfect. It's actually worth taking a lower valuation and getting it in all cash rather than getting a higher valuation, but a chunk of it is money that you may never see. So we went through due diligence. That wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, though things did get very, very intense the last 2 weeks of the transaction, and we ended up closing the deal, I think it was January 21st of 2022. And I was on an airplane when it closed, and my husband texted me to let me know that $10 million had been deposited into our account. That was wild. And 3 weeks after the transaction closed, my partner and I were out. And this is what I've been doing ever since, talking to people about entrepreneurship, trying to make entrepreneurship more accessible. We do it in a way that strips out the BS and the gatekeeping that you see with a lot of thought leaders in this field. So that's my story. Usually when I tell my story, there are tons of questions. I have so many videos on here that go into answering a lot of those questions, so check those out. But if you have specific questions, leave them in the comments below and I'll try to answer them with a future video. Thanks for listening.